Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. In this video, I'm going to be reacting to Economics Explains video titled Infinite Growth is Possible and It Can Be Sustainable. Whereas I definitely think the first one is true, the second one really depends on your definition of sustainable, and really the bigger question is, does it really matter? But let's get started with what he has to say on GDP growth as a whole.
Target a long-term growth rate of around 2 to 3%. The world as a whole has had a GDP growth rate of a little over 3% over the past 5 decades, and developing economies like China target an even higher rate because they want to catch up with the general quality of life of advanced economies. China in particular has been responsible for lifting more than 1 billion people out of poverty thanks to their intense economic growth over the past 3 decades. So, pursuing economic growth...
This kind of just leads me to the question, as I mentioned this in the Ray Dalio series I did too, is on one hand, you see most economists skeptical of China's year-over-year GDP growth numbers and question the veracity of the data. But then on the other hand, when they look at the cumulative growth of China going back, say, to 1990 and say, oh, it's grown to become the second largest economy and the first adjusted for PPP, and they don't apply the same level of skepticism as they do with the year-over-year growth. I'm not saying China's economy hasn't grown massively, but I think the level that it has grown is far smaller than is claimed, and as a result, maybe the track of unsustainability isn't as bad, especially if the future growth demands less resources than expected.
It really does do a lot of good, but it can also do a lot of harm. Taken to the extreme, there are only so many resources on Earth. There's only so much farmland, iron ore, fossil fuels, and fresh water. We can improve how much we get out of all of these resources by using more efficient farming techniques, recycling, exploring renewables, and building out infrastructure, but there is still ultimately a limit that we are likely to hit first with the damage that the exploitation of all of these resources is doing to our...
I question really how long it will take to hit the limit of things such as food or energy, because there is a mechanism that solves for that, and that is pricing. Like, if it becomes prohibitively expensive to power cars through oil due to a supply shortage, then alternative energies that are more abundant will become economically competitive, and they'll be switching to that. Like, the example of that is what happened with power plants. 20, 30 years ago, crude oil powered most power plants, and now it has switched to natural gas, which is cleaner and cheaper, and this was not primarily done due to environmentalists' concerns, even though that was a positive side effect. It was more driven by the fact that you had a boom in crude oil prices in the 2000s that made powering power plants with oil to be economically unviable, while natural gas was relatively cheap and it was more abundant in geopolitically more favorable areas such as the United States of America. That's one example. I think that what he is missing, though, the resource that can run out and is already running out, I think, and you see the deleterious social and economic consequences of what's going on in many cities around the world, is land, particularly land near major job centers. COVID has allowed some of the white-collar working professionals to work remote, but most of business culture is still in offices, especially in less developed countries. And there are other social benefits to living within major metropolitan areas. And part of the desires of, which I think is driving a lot of the competitiveness for resources, is not just who can make the most stuff for the sake of growing a phantom GDP number, but it's that most countries in the world, and even many people within those countries, want to live the life in upper middle income suburbs in the United States of America, Canada, and Australia, and maybe some more recently developed areas in Europe in this category too. And there isn't enough land in places with good climate, close to major metro areas, and enough space really on an absolute level that everybody can live that lifestyle. Like, the level of resources to live an upper middle class suburban lifestyle, every person in the world, the earth doesn't have that. And that is, I think, the driving point and why there is such a geopolitical scramble, a competition in who gets the share of global trade and resources, etc. In theory, you can say, oh, why don't we just build colonies in the ocean? I mean, 2/3 of the land is ocean, but the cost of doing that and the amount of natural resources in terms of metals and other products needed to construct these floating cities is, I think, again, above carrying capacity at this current point. But I think really the carrying capacity concern for food and other things that are replicable and energy is overstated. But for things such as housing and land is understated. That's part of the reason why we're having housing crises and the highest levels of price to income ratio in pretty much every major developed economy, and in China as well in human history.
Our environment. To combat this, a lot of powerful people have started to champion the idea of a zero growth world. If we don't increase our usage of resources, then things like pollution and greenhouse gas emissions will also stagnate. This is not necessarily incorrect, but the people making these arguments are not the ones that are going to benefit most from economic growth in the coming decades. If an Australian has to do away with a fifth bedroom on their house, or an American has to make do with a car that isn't the size of a one-bedroom apartment, then that's probably a worthy sacrifice to make sure that we don't.
It's not really that easy of a comparison. In fact, really, if you look at it, the motives behind these zero growth advocates are a lot more nefarious than you would think. Most people with these type of critique are in the social and economic elites. They are people who desire just more space and less crowds. And you know what the solution for that is to have less growth, because if you have less growth, it means you have less people. All of nature is left for you. And if you convince most of the population to use less resources due to a need for zero growth, there'll be plenty of oil for your private jet, or plenty of meat for you still to have your Wagyu dinner parties with your other wealthy friends. But that's not really, you don't hear those headlines, because that is mainly just a Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake type of approach, which is just not socially acceptable in the modern era. But I'm going to dive more into this in my Old Money series. But I generally think a lot of the people who are preaching the zero growth is more out of their concern to make sure they get their piece of the pie, and not for, say, some grander environmentalist reasons. And then there's the other factor, and it's just less competition. The thing that really old money people hate more than anything is not the poor. It's other entrepreneurs who are able to climb up and compete and outbid them for their own spaces. And a lot of the people who want a more rigid, fixed class hierarchy tend to be for things that restrict growth or solidify existing social arrangements so upstarts aren't allowed. That's what I think a lot of this is driven by, is just ladder pulling on a social and class level.
Don't destroy our planet. But asking a developing nation, which remember are the ones that often grow at the fastest rate, to not improve the lives of their citizens because all of the advanced economies have screwed up the planet to enrich themselves, is kind of unfair.
Well, that's also why things such as the Kyoto Protocol and a lot of the environmentalists kind of climate change legislation has, on an international scale, has had problems, because it's not really fair either way. It's not fair to, like he says, to force people to not advance up the economic ladder because of feared environmental damage. But it's also not fair, as in many agreements now, that only developed countries have to cut their emissions, and countries like China and India can continue to pollute as much as they want out of some desire of social redistribution. Either way, it makes, somebody has to lose if you do it that way. Either the developed countries never get the chance to develop, or the first world countries now are going to not be able to compete in a fair market because they have way harder environmental standards to measure up against. And then the other thing is, if you do grant exemptions for developing economies, then what's the point of doing this? You're just cutting off your nose to spite your face, because you're going to get the same climate and economic damage anyway. It's just going to come from a different place. Outsourcing a problem is not solving a problem.
Around the world enact a policy of zero growth, the world becomes a zero-sum game.
Yeah, and if you look at human history between the dawn of civilization to about the start of Industrial Revolution, say the mid-18th century, it was a zero-sum game. And I'm going to go into more of this when I do the Old Money series, but anybody who really got rich in that era made it because they used force or some sort of unfair advantage to take from somebody else. Like if you have a zero-sum world, you can't create wealth. Somebody has to lose for every winner, and that creates probably a more violent and a less happy society to live in, because there is no opportunity to advance without taking or hurting somebody else. And that's what I think originally brought a lot of some of the contempt towards accumulated fortunes, because it was a legitimate contempt, because it was, if you don't have economic growth and that's positive, you cannot make money in a way that is not harmful or sinful by the conventional definition. So now that we're aware of the problem, let's try to see what Economics Explained's narrator says is the solution to the problem and see where we stand on it.
That economies can achieve growth. They can do it by simply making more stuff or by making better stuff. Making more stuff is where we would run into problems with living in a finite world. If we ran our entire economy off making steel cable, then the only way that we would be able to grow our economy would be by producing more steel cable. Unfortunately, we would not be able to grow this economy forever because eventually the world would run out of the iron ore and minerals needed to make the steel to make the cable. Of course, real economies don't just make one product, but even today, most of our growth still does come from making the same things, but making more of them. In fact, we often push our economic growth in the direction of making more stuff rather than making better stuff.
Well, that's just because population is growing. If you want to supply the same living standard to a higher amount of people, you're going to have to make more stuff. And then also, there's a lot of people who do live a suboptimal lifestyle, and for those to catch up, you're going to need to make more stuff. It takes a lot more resources for 7 billion people to live an American standard of living versus 300 million.
We don't offshore manufacturing to China because the goods produced there will be more valuable. We do it because we can make more for the same price. If economies were instead to focus on pursuing economic growth through producing goods and services of higher quality, then hard resource limits wouldn't be an issue. Take our cable-making economy again. If this economy instead switched to producing cars, then they would be producing much more value for every unit input of raw materials, and then if they produced luxury wristwatches, they would produce even more value per unit input. Of course, you can't run an economy off making luxury wristwatches. Even Switzerland has the good sense to diversify into dodgy banking. And you also can't grow an economy endlessly by just making more and more expensive products. Sometimes a project will just need a mile of steel cable. But
yeah, that's my main critique really here with this is that this quality over quantity is like, quality really only means something is if you can actually quantify a material improvement standard of living through producing that and a material improvement utility. Like, producing a car worth of raw materials in a car is worth more than producing a car's worth of raw materials in steel cable because there's more utility out of a car. However, you can't just, which I think is really a mistake that might be built into this, make all the watches Rolex watches, even though they're the same thing as the Timex, but have the brand and a perceived higher quality, and therefore people are paying more for watches, automatically means you have a more productive and bigger economy. Just because you pay a higher price for something doesn't mean there's any actual value generated. I mean, this is just a common truism in value investing, which I have a background in, but I think it really can be applied here too. Like, that's the thing. What is the measurement of quality? The reason why quantity is the base output for something like GDP is because it's difficult to quantify quality. And yeah, I think there are certain ways, like just by improving technology. But say, for example, instead of people spending money on buying cars, they spend money buying NFTs, but they pay more money for the NFTs. Is the economy bigger, or is it just being wasted? By traditional definition, yeah, you technically have a bigger economy because more people are sitting at home spending NFTs, so there's more money being flown. But has human life actually improved if you can't leave your house due to the inability to drive due to climate restrictions, making energy costs too high? That's really the dilemma and the question I have for Economics Explained here is that what's the line? How do you adjust for that? I think if you really want to improve material standard of living, you need to increase physical materials. It's not going to work just on just switching everything to digital high-tech products and then just quote-unquote growing through people more spending on things that are cleaner. I mean, I think that could on the margin do something, but you cannot build an entire global economy based off of it.
But rather than just trying to build the most valuable things we possibly can out of the materials available to us, we can instead choose to not build things that intentionally forego quality for cheapness. Fast fashion, disposables, and even poorly constructed buildings are perfect examples of this. It takes just as many bricks and building materials to put together a shoddy house as it does to build one that will stand for 100 years.
I agree on this one. I think the fast fashion does kind of make sense, though, in the sense that trends rapidly change and there's really no point of wearing something super out of style forever. But this, and also a lot of younger people, such as teenagers, just simply can't afford buying higher end products. However, with like shoddy building standards, yeah, I mean, especially in developed countries, maybe we should just build better quality housing. I mean, this is a common thing I've seen in one of my travels in Asia, and these condos that buildings they construct in places like China and Vietnam, they look all nice when they're new, but they don't have a very long shelf life and they deteriorate within 30 years. Whereas if you build like a condo in a developed country, it will last 50 years or more. And with modern building technology, we could build houses that last longer. We already done that with cars. Like the average car on the road 30 years ago was maybe 7 to 8 years. Now it's 10 to 12. Why couldn't we have houses that last hundreds of years with minimum renovation? There's the technological capability. And the problem with housing costs anyway are not due to building, even though has been a problem during the post-pandemic boom. But generally, housing costs have been driven by land. Land, especially in major cities, land is the primary driver of that. So the marginal increase of improving the quality of a house won't affect the bottom line sticker price as much, just because most of what the buyer is paying for is land anyway. So I think that it could be part of the solution here. I agree on this.
It just takes more careful planning and a better tradesman. On the extreme opposite end of this spectrum, we have the digital economy. Some of the most valuable businesses in the entire world produce services that have practically zero marginal resource use. I think you would agree that watching a show on Netflix, or even watching this video right now, has provided you with some value, and it's also providing that value to hundreds of thousands of other viewers as well. It has provided this...
Yeah, I already went into my critique of this. Digital content is difficult to value, but would a Ready Player One metaverse world be something that we really want to strive to create? If that's the only solution, then I think climate change may be a better outcome than that from a human happiness perspective.
This value, despite the fact that my small team and I barely used any finite resources to make and share this video.
Low-key, also, the other thing that could benefit greatly from this is if people choose to live healthier lifestyles. I mean, it's probably super politically incorrect to say, but I think the obesity epidemic is really like the prime example of misallocation of resources, and also that is very profitable for businesses because they make more profits selling more stuff to the same person who really marginally doesn't need it. But the bottom line is what he says here on material productivity. I'll let him explain it, and then I'll say my final comments.
That material productivity is increasing in most economies that we have data on, but it's not increasing fast enough. The best first step that we can take to fixing this shortfall is to simply make this measure a big deal. By simply paying attention to this metric and giving it the same weight as we do raw GDP figures, for example, we will naturally enact policies that promote material productivity, re-elect governments that deliver strong material productivity growth, and all the while, we will be pursuing limitless growth in a finite world.
The other thing in terms of productivity that's not really being factored in is labor productivity. Like our economy is not growing nearly as much as it could, just simply because if you look at developed nations at least, labor productivity is at record lows. Some people might be saying that work remote is causing people to be lazy. Others say it's just simply there's not any more stuff being produced, but there's a lot more jobs due to social reasons. I will elaborate that in a different video because the whole labor productivity hole is a giant can of worms that I can't really cover in this video. Overall, this concludes my thoughts on economics explain infinite growth is possible. I do agree infinite growth is possible. And whether it's sustainable or not really depends on your definition of sustainable. I don't really expect, you cannot cut energy consumption in a material way and expect higher standards of living from a material perspective. Maybe you can fool some people into thinking they have a higher quality of life by plugging them into the matrix, and that's not really a long-term sustainable outcome. I think that a lot of the limitations to natural resources can be solved through price mechanism. Like if resources really got too expensive to develop them on Earth, it'd make sense on space, or higher prices just force creativity, as we see in the energy sector for generations. However, the one challenging one I can't really figure out is how do we make land more efficient? That seems to be, I think, especially in developed economies, the primary barrier to growth, and the excess amount of people spending on housing costs or real estate investment is creating a giant sinkhole into the economy as well. Let me know what you think, and if you have any questions, and enjoy the rest of your week.